Okay, sure. We've talked about research questions, we've talked about hypotheses, but what is the null hypothesis? And what does that have to do with the alternative hypothesis? Well, this video is going to help you out. We're going to clarify what the null hypothesis is, what the alternative hypothesis is. Let's head into the lab. The null hypothesis is a fundamental concept in statistical hypothesis testing. It's a statement that suggests there is no significant difference, effect, or relationship between the variables being studied. In other words, it assumes that any observed differences or effects are due to random chance or sampling error rather than a true relationship. In simple terms, the null suggests that there is nothing significant going on. In a hypothesis test, researchers start with a null hypothesis. This is often denoted as H0, and the alternative hypothesis is often denoted as H1 or H2, whatever the numbering follows. The null hypothesis represents the status quo, or a baseline assumption that there's no effect, no difference, no relationship, while the alternative hypothesis suggests that there is a significant effect, difference, or relationship. But here's the catch. When you look at a research study, in most cases, they only show you the H1 or the H2. In other words, the null hypothesis is hidden. You won't see it. But it is behind the scenes and being used as the basis for determining if your results are significant or not. I like to use an analogy when explaining the null hypothesis. Say you had a quarter, and you see on one side that it's the head side, but the other side you don't see is the tail side. Just like the coin, when you and I read an academic journal, we see the head side, the alternative hypothesis, but what's behind it is the tail side, the null hypothesis. Here we see a recent study on mothers' use of smartphones, and we can see the title of the study here, and if we scroll down, we are able to see the first hypothesis. You can see it here. Continue to scroll down, you'll see the second hypothesis, and the third, and so on. Now, what you're seeing are actually what we call the alternative hypotheses. This is not the null. These are actually alternatives to the null. Let's take a closer look. In our example, we see the second hypothesis says this: situational guilt about smartphone use while parenting is associated with lower situation coping efficacy. So what's the null? Situational guilt about smartphone use while parenting will not be associated with lower situation coping efficacy. Let's look at another one from the same study, hypothesis 3. A greater technoference perception is related to higher situational guilt. So what's the null? Well, technoference perception is unrelated to situational guilt. What are the steps in determining if your results are significant? Well, the first step is to collect data. These are your observed results. Next, you're going to analyze the data, and you're going to do this to determine whether your observed results, the ones you collected, are likely due to random chance, or if they provide enough evidence to reject the null in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Next, you will interpret the results. The outcome of the hypothesis test is typically expressed in terms of a p-value. The p-value represents the probability of obtaining results as extreme or more extreme than the observed results under the assumption that the null hypothesis is true. So when you get a low p-value, typically below a predetermined significance level like 0.05, that low p-value will lead to the rejection of the null hypothesis, indicating that there's evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. It's important to note that failing to reject the null hypothesis does not prove the null hypothesis is true. It simply means that there's not enough evidence to reject it based on the collected data. So let's say you had a p-value of 0.06. It doesn't quite meet that standard of being less than 0.05. So in this case, we would accept the null and not reject it. And that would not provide enough evidence for our alternative hypothesis. The null serves as a default assumption to be tested and challenged, and its role is critical in the scientific method and statistical inference.